All right, I think it's time for us to start. There are some more people coming in, but that's fine. They'll catch up with us later. I would like to welcome everyone to this Drift event on sustainability transitions to solve climate change. My name is Lara and I'll be the moderator today. I am currently a sustainable development master student and also currently working as an intern at Drift, which is the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions. So I would just like to say that while I'm the moderator today, I'm also at the same time the target audience, which is students. So I'm also very excited to see what we're going to learn today. I hope there are some more students with me. We'll get to that later. But yeah, I'm happy to see so many registrations, also from colleges and universities. So that's good to see. Quickly, just to introduce the team, I organized this event together with Sophie Buchel, who is the technical host today. So if you have any difficulties or questions, you can send her a message in the chat, either privately or if it's relevant for everyone, in the general chat. I want to just give you a short introduction of the campaign this event is part of. It's part of a Solve Climate by 2030 campaign that is organized by Bard College in New York. You might have read it while registering for this event. As Eben Goodstein said, it was the main goal of this project to make climate a class, basically meaning that we should focus on sustainability and climate change topics to have a bigger role in education in all disciplines. So that's also the goal of today, to really look at climate change from an interdisciplinary perspective and see what the role does it play in other disciplines. So I encourage you to also think about that while listening to the speakers. So this event, the Global Dialogue, that's a worldwide series of webinars. It's this week and next week. It's occurring all over the world. And it's addressing themes of green recovery, climate solutions, and just transitions. And as Drift, we were, of course, happy to jump on that last theme, just transitions, because we think that the climate crisis concerns our shared future, and it is key that coming generations are involved in the discussion about this, and also key is that we are involved in the solutions. So it's important to think about that now. And we're addressing this question: how can we use the decade ahead of us to accelerate a transition that tackles climate change in a way that is just? In order to do that, we'll look at this question from three perspectives. So first of all, we'll have a climate change transformation perspective, we'll have a justice perspective, and we'll have a climate activism stance. We'll have a short discussion in groups afterwards to really try to apply it to your own research field. And then we'll end with a plenary Q&A with the speakers, in which we'll have plenty of options to ask anything you'd like about this topic. So that all being said, I think I've spoken enough now. I would like to give the floor to our first speaker. She is Dr. Katarina Hilscher. She's a senior researcher at Drift, and she's going to tell us about positioning climate change in the broader context of sustainability challenges we face today. These challenges are deeply rooted in our societies, and they call for radical changes called transitions, in our behaviors, technologies, values, and other things. So I would like her to have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Lara. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar also from my side. As Lara said, I will tell you a story about essentially how we can make sense of the many challenges that we face today. And climate change is obviously part of this story, but I want to show and emphasize that we cannot look at climate change or in any way solve climate change without also looking at the bigger picture. Okay, so this is giving you the very doom and gloom side of things, but it's no secret that our world today faces many problems, including, for example, biodiversity loss, conflicts and wars and deforestation. On the image on the right, we can see that we are crossing many of our Earth boundaries that allow us to safely and sustainably live on our planet. And we also fall short in ensuring a good and equitable social foundation, meaning to provide food, water, and healthcare and education to all. The drivers and causes of our global challenges are deeply rooted in our societies. And this includes how we extract resources, how we produce and consume energy, food and clothes, and how we travel. And this, of course, also holds true to climate change. So scientists agree that climate change is 100% due to us humans and the emissions we emit into the atmosphere. And I want to invite you to guess which city is shown in the background here. The picture demonstrates the tons of carbon dioxide that New York City added to the atmosphere in 2010. It was 54 million metric tons. And some examples of human activities generating emissions and thus causing climate change are the increased use of fossil fuels such as coal, oil and gas to generate electricity and heat, to run cars and other forms of transport, and to power manufacturing and our industry. Another cause is deforestation, because living trees absorb and store carbon dioxide, and also farming releases huge levels of emissions into the atmosphere. And these examples also make clear that the human drivers of climate change are also often very similar to driving all the other sustainability challenges we saw on the previous slide. But climate change also adds to this mix of other existing problems and amplifies them, like biodiversity loss and pollution. And today, we especially focus on social justice and climate change, where the impacts of climate change will be felt by each and every one of us. Climate change will not affect all of us equally. And especially those with the least access to resources will face a much higher burden from climate change, while generally having contributed much less to it, amongst others because they consume and travel less. So for example, climate change causes droughts and flood risks, which decrease agricultural productivity. And this means lost income, food prices will rise, and also food availability will become less predictable, increasing the risk of famines and malnutrition. People will also lose their homes due to floods, and especially lower income people already live in flood-prone areas. And some areas like islands in the Pacific will just disappear. Conflicts over resources and land will increase. And this will lead to displacement and climate migration. So the picture on the back here shows a miniature migrant camp that was set up by Oxfam already in 2009 to remind the European Union that many millions of people have already been displaced as a result of climate stresses, and projections foresee many millions of climate migrants over the coming decades. So summing up this doom and gloom part of the story, our world is unsustainable because of us, and climate change amplifies existing problems, including injustice. And this is where we call for a transition out of climate change. We need to radically change, for example, infrastructures, behaviors, and lifestyles to address climate change and to contribute to a sustainable and just world. So how can we understand transitions? Remember that sustainability problems are deeply rooted in our societies, and this means that we cannot solve these problems without addressing also the underlying drivers of them. There are just no quick fixes. In a nutshell, transitions are long-term processes of fundamental change in the underlying cultures, structures, and practices of society. So cultures include how we talk and think about and value things. For example, do we want to continue eating processed food, farmed somewhere far away in greenhouses and transported all over the world? Structures mean that we change our policies and regulations to, for example, give everyone a carbon budget, and to ensure that companies cannot make profit from exploiting nature and people. Structures also include physical infrastructures that need to become long-lasting and sustainable. And finally, practices refer to our daily lifestyles and routines. So, for example, whether we take the bike or public transport or the car to move around. But more specifically, we talk about sustainability transitions. And this means that we take sustainability as an end goal for our future human development. Sustainability essentially means that environmental, social, and economic goals are addressed in synergy. So, for example, economic growth cannot be the only goal for our societies, and it needs to be linked to justice and nature protection. And then looking from this long-term end goal, we can then ask which changes in our culture, structures, and practices need to happen to move from our current state of unsustainability problems to sustainability. So, for example, we can zoom in on the energy system and look into the transition that needs to happen towards a more sustainable energy system. This involves, for example, a shift from fossil fuel-based energy sources towards renewables to reduce emissions and pollution. But besides only requiring changes in technologies, this also requires changes in behaviors and consumption practices. So, for example, people can become so-called prosumers. They produce and consume their own energy in a decentralized way, also taking away power from big energy companies. And people also need to reduce the energy consumption overall and make it more flexible. So when then specifically talking about transitions out of climate change, it means that climate action, including mitigation action to reduce emissions and adaptation actions to prepare and cope with the impacts of climate change, can and should create opportunities to contribute to sustainability transitions. And that is very important in view of social justice. The transition perspective on climate change makes clear that we cannot fight climate change without considering other sustainability challenges and in particular social justice. For example, also measures even to adapt to climate change can have negative and unequal consequences on people. Now this picture shows the High Line in New York City. The High Line is an old train track that has been transformed into an urban park. And in principle, it's a good measure because green space offers a lot of benefits, including protection from floods. It provides shared community space and it helps to protect biodiversity, and it also increases mental health and well-being. But the High Line also contributed to the gentrification of the neighborhood and made housing unaffordable for many of the former residents, who as a result were forced to move away and out of the city center. And besides, lower income people often live already in neighborhoods that have much less access to green space. So I want to close with a view on how we can steer such transitions out of climate change and to sustainability and justice. Overall, transitions are complex and highly uncertain processes, and there's just not one silver bullet solution. And this means that we cannot command and control transitions or manage them in a top-down way. And they're also not in the hands of just one actor like the governments, but it's actually in the hands of all of us who need to take actions to implement the changes. There are growing examples that climate change and justice can be addressed together. An example is, for example, the European Union support to coal regions. The aim is to help 42 regions across 12 European countries to transition to a low carbon economy. But this also means that a lot of people might lose their jobs. So the platform offers tailored assistance and also supports retraining for green jobs. Another example is that in Indonesia, the president removed transport fuel subsidies with the promise of better alternatives to promote development rather than cheap fuel. And the subsidies were then replaced with investments in infrastructure and poverty reduction programs. And most of these initiatives taken to ensure equitable and just transition have some common ingredients that also relate to how transitions can be steered. One is the participation of affected workers and communities in planning and advancing climate action. The other one is anticipation of negative impacts, also for different groups of peoples, and especially for vulnerable people, through long-term planning and impact assessments. And finally, support programs for that include financing and also capacity building, for example, retraining for new jobs. Thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you, Katarina. Very interesting, this introduction into transitions. I could already think of a question, but I think I'll save it for the Q&A. Since I don't think we have any clarifying questions for you right now, I think we'll go right to the second speaker. You already touched upon some climate justice issues, and this is also where the second speaker will be focusing on. So Shivant Jagru is going to be speaking to you. He is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs at Leiden University. And he will focus on connecting climate and social issues in the transition, and both in transition problems and the solutions. He will also speak about the role of marginalized communities and the role of institutional and privileged actors. So I'm curious to see how we're gonna zoom in and learn more about this justice perspective. So Shivant, take it away. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. I hope you can hear me and see the slide. Yeah, so what I want to zoom in on today is, pick up on this idea of sustainable transitions that are actually needed in order to really, in an effective way, tackle climate change. What we need to do with while center staging climate justice. So I will be talking about how climate justice as a concept, as a perspective, that really highlights structural inequalities, especially the role of marginalized communities, and put them at the center stage in order to understand specifically problems, but also solutions when it comes to the climate crisis. And I want to start with the global impact that is uneven. I think we've heard it already earlier today, that we know that climate change is not just caused by humanity, and it's not just impacting humanity in general, right? So the impact of climate crisis is uneven on a global scale. We know that in the global south, the impact is much harder, much more direct as we speak. Think, for example, about small islands that are currently living in these climate emergencies. And we know also what the root cause of this uneven distribution is of climate risks, namely the role of especially rich countries historically and their industrial capitalist models of economic growth. So in order to really understand this from a climate justice perspective, we need to highlight this uneven structure and center stage that, quote unquote, remote suffering that is not just out there in the global south, it's directly entangled with the way in which we, the global north, organize our economic systems. This also means that we have the potential here, the opportunity to link it to discourses and initiatives around anti-racism. And this is relevant because we know that especially low-income countries and groups and people of color on a global scale are impacted the most, while having contributed to climate change the least. So there is, climate justice highlights the idea that it's not enough to only think about climate change and climate solutions, but also link it to racial justice and draw these connections more clearly instead of only seeing them as climate issues. And when we think about solutions, very often we tend to think about them, and by we, I mean many governments and business leaders tend to think of sustainable technologies as solutions. So think about, renewable energy technologies, and the example of the electric vehicle is of course very, very, very pertinent, in that it tries to move away from a fossil regime into a more electric kind of energy or mobility regime that is much more clean and green. But we also know at the same time that these technologies can also be problematic, even though they might be presented as necessary technologies for the transition. So think, for example, about electric vehicles as just a case in point. In order to produce the batteries of many of these electric vehicles, we need finite resources. We need cobalt, we need lithium, we need minerals and metals that are mined in countries with either a colonial history or in more poor regions that are conflict prone. Think, for example, about the cobalt crisis in the Republic of Congo. In almost slave-like conditions, kids are mining these minerals that are in fact also providing the input of the batteries, the electric vehicles, and thus the technologies that fuel our sustainable energy regime. So we need to think critically about what we present as solutions, and especially this dark side of the electric alternatives. So what climate justice really does in this particular context is it addresses new forms of extractionism, new forms of problematic economic models that might reproduce injustices, and forms of violence that are rendered invisible, that are rendered inaudible. And it calls for strict regulations, for example, about the role of institutions, in the European Commission, for example, that might have imposed much stricter regulations when it comes to accepting electric vehicles with these problematic histories, with this problematic supply chain, while at the same time taking it a step further and also create alternative visions, radically green visions that are also socially just and do not depend on new forms of exploitation. When we think more locally about solutions that are presented by city officials or policymakers, there are all kinds of climate projects or subsidies that are presented. But based on my own research also, what I've found is that in many of these cases, what you see is a set of usual suspects that applies for these subsidies or that participates in these projects and initiatives. For example, about sustainable energy or food and networks in the Netherlands. There's a subsidy that has been imposed, for example, a few years back, that has been introduced to provide people with a small kind of budget or grant to create a kind of a climate initiative themselves. But these forms were very technical, very difficult to understand. It also assumes a specific network, specific know-how, specific skills, specific set of income and social capital that basically also excludes a lot of people. So when we think of solutions in the role of governments, what climate justice also does, it addresses how climate policies, climate initiatives, and climate strategies can also create and reproduce social exclusion, which means that we need to center stage also inclusive policies, inclusive thinking, when we design these kinds of solutions, especially providing resources and funding for local communities. There was, of course, also a lot of nice inspirations to draw on. One that I really like is this transition town activist garden Ron Finley in the US. What he does is he basically, I think it's in LA, where he basically says we need to dig into the ground and reconnect to nature, and especially in these unprivileged or deprived neighborhoods, so to say, with the so-called food deserts. We need to especially connect the youth to the ground and to fresh produce. They can grow it themselves. So we need to get gangster with your shovel and just plant some shit. So it's also an act of resistance, occupying these public spaces and turning them into communities of care while reconnecting to nature and addressing environmental issues and climate issues in a radically different way. This brings me to the closing. So what I wanted to this take home message is that I think we need to take seriously climate justice as a guiding perspective in addressing climate crisis. So climate issues are also political and ethical issues. That means that we need to connect climate and social issues and understand transition problems and solutions from that point of view. And it particularly highlights the role of marginalized communities in specific transition projects that can be local, can be regional, or that can be transnational. At the same time, what we also need to do is hold institutional and privileged actors accountable for just sustainable change, because in many instances, they have resources that other communities and people do not have. So we can hold them accountable at the same time. And in terms of education, I think that's a really important point to take into account as well, is at every school, university level where there's a course on climate change or the environment, it's not a technical or a natural science issue. It is also a political issue, which means we need to center stage climate justice as well in the educational system. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this justice perspective on sustainability transitions, which I think is very important. It really shows that it doesn't only matter what we do, but also how we do it and with who we do it. So that's always good to keep in mind. If there are no clarifying questions, I would just like to dive into the last speaker, which is Mara de Pater, who also works at Drift. She's a researcher at Drift, and she is going to zoom in even more on this sustainability transitions topic. And then specifically the role citizens can play in these type of transitions, which is also something I often think about. It can feel really like a far away and really abstract, but there's a lot to do as citizens as well. And she will use social movement and citizenship theory and also some practical examples to show us that. So yeah, go ahead, Mara. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to Katarina and to Shivant as well for explaining the need for a transition, but also for centering climate justice in this transition. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about citizenship, which will enhance an understanding of how you or me as an individual can have a place in this transition. And I just want to start with a very basic understanding of citizenship. And I think very important in that is to see that citizenship is about a relational or a relation between individuals and their polity, which is the society and the politics involved with that, and that it's about a constant interplay between rights to, in a way, make use or have freedom in that polity, but also to carry certain responsibilities towards other members or towards the entire community. And then a very normative understanding of within citizenship is the term environmental citizenship. And within environmental citizenship, it's basically the same as the type of citizenship I just explained. The only thing is that people who identify as environmental citizens, or maybe they don't consciously do that, but people that can be seen as environmental citizens, they have a very strong normative notion, and that normative notion is often very close to the idea of climate justice or environmental justice, as we just heard. That means that the rights and responsibilities that I just talked about change a little bit. It gets broader than just the liberal rights to freedom, for example. There's also a right to a clean and safe environment and a right to make use of that environment. And then at the same time, the responsibilities that you as an environmental citizen have feed into these rights. So you're responsible for preserving that environment, and you're also responsible to ensure that everyone in your polity has equal rights. And interestingly, the scale of your polity also changes. It's no longer the nation state or your municipality or maybe your household. But it also takes into account future generations, maybe people that live downstream from a river that you're connected to in case of, for example, water pollution. And it also takes into account environmental parts. So, for example, species living in an ecosystem you're connected to. And these rights and responsibilities then also are there for those species. I hope this gives a bit of an understanding of environmental citizenship just in general. I quickly want to touch upon the acts of environmental citizenship, and I'm going to give two examples to make this a little bit clearer. I think, first of all, there is a politicizing of private behavior. And I think for most of you, it would be pretty clear what it is. It's, for example, conscious consumption. So in your day-to-day individual behavior, you implement those notions of environmental justice. Could also be like boycotting certain brands if you feel they're not acting very just. But on the other hand, there's also a more community part to it, where you're acting upon these responsibilities more towards others in your community, or maybe even organizations or politicians. And that would be climate advocacy and activism. And within both of these two types of acts of environmentalism, so the private behavior as well as climate advocacy, there is always a range between narrow and deep environmentalism. And I want to focus on deep environmentalism, as that is, I'd say, closer to the topics of climate justice that we just discussed. So deep environmentalism would be to challenge the underlying structures that cause these environmental problems. And these can be political, economic, social, can also be, for example, neo-colonial. And what I'm going to do is give two examples. And in that, I'm kind of assuming that most of you are in pretty privileged positions, that most of you have the capacity to act, are not directly threatened maybe by climate issues, but that's just an assumption, so maybe this doesn't refer to you. But I think that's also something that is important to take into account when we're thinking about environmental citizenship, that there's a big difference in responsibility to take according to your capacity to act, and that is often based on certain privileges you have, which often come from injustices in the past. That being said, I'm going to give two examples. Both are in the Netherlands. So Groningen is an area in the north of the Netherlands, and there's a big field of gas basically under Groningen. So in the past decades, they've been extracting a lot of gas, and one of the results from that were earthquakes. And already since a few years, local communities have been fighting for a right to a safe living environment. That's where one part of the citizenship comes in, the right. And then multiple years later, this struggle was joined by a big group of, I'd say, the climate movement, who had a slightly different struggle in mind, because they felt the responsibility to future generations, but also current generations living in areas that are impacted by climate change. And these two groups, so the locals and the more international climate movement, joined forces to basically tell the companies active in the gas extraction and also the government to take their responsibility and kind of dialing back on the extraction. So that's an example where rights and responsibilities come together in different groups. And the second example I wanted to give is the fossil-free groups. Some of you might have heard of them. They're pretty spread over the entire world, I think mainly in the US and some European countries. And these are groups of basically students that see a need or a responsibility to act and participate in their community, which is the university, and then point to the responsibility of the university to change their acts. And that's mainly in the investments that these universities do in fossil fuel companies or fossil fuel infrastructure. And this is an interesting example because this is a very dynamic polity that you can see. So a dynamic community. On the one hand, there's the students that participate within their university. They point towards the responsibility of the university in a bigger crowd. And then lastly, these individual student groups interact with other student groups. That's also why it says global, a global community of student groups in different universities acting on the same knowledge and the same principles. I've almost talked for 10 minutes. I just wanted to round off with a few questions you can ask yourself to kind of see how can I act on these notions. I just gave some examples to kind of spark and inspire you to act. And I'd say as an individual, it's important to get an understanding of what your responsibility, but also your privileges are. But never forget that it's mostly, big corporations, but also politicians that have much more influence to ask. So this responsibility for you can also be telling others to act more responsibly. And I think I'll just leave the slide on for a little bit and not tell all the questions out loud. And I think that's it. I'll give the word back to Lara.
Thanks a lot, Mara, for this introduction to more theoretical perspectives on citizenship. That was very interesting to see.
Peace building and transformation or transition can go hand in hand. It's interdisciplinary work. So we are ready to help, also support with our academic knowledge and also our field works.
Yeah,
Thank
nice.
you for this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting point that you're making about all these different movements and these different groups and how to build bridges between them, right? Because I think that's also what we're really trying to explore with this theme of approaching climate change or the climate crisis, not just from an environmental perspective or not just from an academic perspective, but also from a social justice perspective, and trying to bring the different communities that are working on these issues together, and also in different places and different languages, like you're saying. So I actually had a question to our panel that kind of relates to that. Maybe it's a nice bridge. So in some of the literatures that I have been reading about environmental justice or climate justice, the environmental and for instance, the anti-racism movement seem to align quite a bit, like in some cases in the United States, in urban environmental justice. But from my experience as an activist in the Netherlands, the environmental or climate movement is actually very white and not very attuned to the anti-racism struggle. So I was curious, maybe to Shivant or Mara, do you recognize that observation, and why do you think in the Netherlands they're so separate, and how can we maybe bridge that those communities more?
Yeah, I actually definitely recognize this. And I think one of the reasons that the climate movement in the Netherlands is so wide, and I would say also pretty male dominated, is that for a long time the conversations within the climate movement were very technical and very environmental focused. And I think, Sophie, that's kind of what you mentioned just now, is that connecting these struggles is such an important part of environmental justice as well. And that's something I think the Dutch climate movement has been failing in for a really long time, which also meant that a big group of people that wasn't necessarily so, I wouldn't want to say concerned about climate or environment, but that the climate or environment wasn't their first and foremost struggle, didn't feel seen or heard within the climate movement, which is why, for example, the anti-racism movement, but also the feminist movement kind of went different ways. And I do definitely see a change in the last 2 years, I think, where these topics are being discussed more and more within the climate movement as well. And we are seeing much more collaborations between movements. But I think another important part in that is also within social movements, identity is a very important part. So if you don't see yourself represented in leaders in a movement or sort of the general image of the movement, you wouldn't want to join it or be the voice of it. Yeah. So I think it kind of reinforces itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly add? Can I quickly add, because you also asked me to see if that's also the case, and I totally agree, Mara. I fully recognize that there's a the environmental movement, but also at the level of policy making, at the level of companies, at the level of the NGOs, is predominantly highly educated, white, often male, and that's such a selective group if you look at the problem. So I've been also involved in some of these networks, and I try to advocate for ways to decolonize climate discourse in a way, because it allows us to understand the problem, the historicity of the climate crisis in a different way, and it teases out new connections between class, race, income inequality, and gender. So that also, for me, it's important to think through these issues. What I find very useful is an intersectional way of thinking about climate change, including class differences. So I know there's this idea of make climate a class. So my idea would be to insert, struggle more. So make climate a class struggle, not only economic class struggle, but it's also gender, it's also race. And I also recognize that there are more and more connections being drawn across those different movements. So that's very promising, even though that's a very challenging position to have. But I see that that's slowly but surely changing in the Netherlands, at least.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me just move to a question from Carol that she already asked during, I think, before the breakout room. Because she asks, in terms of social justice, is the question of the polluter pays well enough understood and, more importantly, regulated? Maybe Shivant, or who can I give the floor? Katarina?
No, it's anyway. Well, I would just give a very short answer and say no, it's neither well understood nor very much regulated. So, and this also resembles a lot of the, especially international discussions on climate change, that there's always this debate between the global north, the so-called global north, and the so-called global south. Actually saying, like, where the global south is, like political positions are, why should we now take action when we have actually not contributed to the problem? And the same is, I think there are now, looking at the European New Green Deal, there are important steps that are being taken towards also having really much more stronger regulations. But if we look at the generally how our society and how our economy works, I don't see many examples of where polluters are actually made to pay. So neither with like a functioning carbon budget, nor with really being accountable for the waste that is produced, or for planned obsolescence of products, or for, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Basically for chemicals that are being used and also put out in the environment. And I think so. My research, I have found that this is really one of the main next steps that we need to take on any sustainability or climate or justice. In the end, it also doesn't matter which label we put on things, but that, yes, so we have like some nice visions. We have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We have visions for sustainability and resilience on city levels, but these are not being decisively implemented because there is no concrete regulation on this. And this is, of course, a very politicized issue. So politicians or the governments are really hesitant to actually put something more strict in place on this.
Thanks. Yeah,
I would actually love to add something.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Something else that's not being talked about a lot is then how this money basically that comes in from the polluter pays principle is being reallocated. And I think there's a very strong social or environmental justice element in that sort of the additional income that's being collected is also spent in the right places, in the places where either climate adaptation is much needed, or communities that struggle most with the impacts of the areas being polluted. And I think that's also a really important conversation to have once you're going to implement these types of regulations.
Definitely. Shifan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly, because I think I totally agree. But it's still, I think what explains very much the lack of urgency is that there is this move towards green growth, green capital, that is presented as the alternative. So yes, polluter pays principle or carbon pricing, you have all these kind of mechanisms that you could present. And if it becomes too much of a challenge for investors or big industries to adapt to change, then basically policies will be conservative. They will not be progressive. They will not be including social justice issue and environmental strict ambition. So there's also a need to reimagine the economy. And there's a need to rethink how we can provide for a social economy that is much more, redistributes in a much more fundamental way than these piecemeal kind of pragmatic changes.
Yeah, and David asked a question which related to this, and something I want to pick from that question is like, what are your views on how we can support the lower income so they're not left behind in this transition?
That's me?
Yeah,
oh,
sure.
okay. By all means necessary, to be honest. It can be, but NGOs, if you know people that have the network, the resources, the connections, especially the more, the more power and resources you have in society, the more responsible you are basically to do that, to reach out, to make those connections. And I always love to highlight the role of the state as a public institution that has responsibility for, to protect everyone's health, everyone's environmental and climate livelihoods, but especially low-income groups, people with, with less of these networks and with low income. So yeah, I think there's not one silver bullet to do the job.
Yeah,
it's
right.
and.
Yeah. And Katarina, I think Dawood asked the question that you might be able to answer about the energy transitions. And he asked, do we really want to ignore the free fossil fuel resources as we have to shut down oil and gas wells? What is your take on that?
My take is that I'm honestly also struggling to understand the question. So what are all the free fossil fuel-based resources that we have? And just taking the other perspective that we have the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, we know that if we transgress this goal, we will be really facing a lot of problems. And then when we compare the oil and gas reserves that we still have with the emissions we are still able to put in the atmosphere, when we want to keep to the 1.5 degree goal, there's just a huge carbon bubble. So it's just not, in a way, we just don't want to, so neither like are fossil fuel resources free.
Yeah.
And especially if we take a long-term sustainability perspective, someone will pay for them in any way, in one way or another. And yeah, so I would say definitely, yes, we really want to keep as many fossil fuel resources in the ground.
Yeah. All right. And then I think we'll have to move to the last question before rounding off, which is actually a question to the whole panel. Since this event is part of a wider global campaign on the role of education in these topics, how do you see the role of education in the coming decade? What should, for example, universities, high schools, what should they do more or less the coming decade to accelerate this transition? Maybe Mara, you can start.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think education is nowadays so much focused on qualifying people, giving them information to get them educated in a certain field, and much less on educating students to be citizens. There's the word again. Just giving them the skills to act as a responsible citizen. And I think much more time within education can be spent on that as well. That would be my answer.
Thanks, Katarina and Sivan, your final take on the education part.
Yeah, I basically agree with what Mara said. So it's really about actually instilling reflexivity, critical thinking, and also some complexity thinking in the education system. because so all the topics that we talk about, there's no easy solution, there's no easy answer. There are a lot of different interconnected problems. So we can talk about climate change, we can talk about sustainability, we can talk about pollution, we can talk about injustice, about many, many other things. So the point is about actually helping students making sense of these things, and also, but in an empowering way that enables everyone to identify their role and their responsibility in this transition process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Maybe Shivant in about 30 seconds.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. No need to really add. I think the only thing that I would add is just to say that, you know, instead of looking at climate change in this kind of technical natural science way, we need to see it in more artistic ways, in more ethical ways, in more political ways, in more sociological ways, because those disciplines have been lacking in the discourse about climate change. And as soon as we have that balance right, we can have a more comprehensive understanding informed by more socially just strategies and ways of thinking.
Yeah, interesting, thank you. Yeah, I would have many more questions, but I'm afraid we have to round off. I want to just quickly show you a few slides before we go to the weekend. So in terms of follow-up, this global campaign is going to repeat next year. They want to expand it even more, where there are now 100 universities and organizations participating. Next year, there will be hopefully around 800 to 1,000 with like a global night on climate and justice as well next year, March. So we'll send a follow-up email to all participants today with more information. And next to that, I wanted to point out that this event was actually the kickoff of an event series for Drift with just sustainability transitions as the leading hashtag. And our next event is going to be already at the 22nd of April, which will be on diversifying power, energy, and climate justice. So it really relates to our discussion today as well, which will be with Professor Jenny C. Stevens. So in our email, we'll also include the event page where you can register for this one. So we really hope to see you all there as well. And then lastly, I want to thank the speakers for today and their valuable input. I personally learned a lot more, so I hope the audience did as well. I really enjoyed your talks, and also the audience, thanks for your questions and your input. And we really hope to see you at one of our next events. So enjoy the weekend, and thanks a lot.